There was once a group of blind men who approached an unknown object and attempted to identify it. The first man came forward and, using his sense of touch, felt it to be very long and very smooth and to have a sharp point on the end, and he concluded that it was a spear. And then the next blind man came forward and felt it to be large and flat and flexible, and he concluded that it was a fan. And one by one this continued as the men came forward and concluded that it was a rope, or the trunk of a tree, or a wall, or a snake. But in fact, all of the men were wrong, and what they were really examining was an elephant. And when I hear this ancient parable, what I think of is that the men are actually the best and the brightest in all of their fields and all of their disciplines within the sciences and the arts and the humanities, and they're bringing all of their creativity and their powers of observation to bear on this question, but without actually communicating with one another and listening to one another and collaborating, they're unable to see the whole picture. And when I hear this ancient parable, I also don't think of an elephant, but what I think of is this. I think of our planet and all of the ecosystems that sustain us and give us clean water and fresh air and food and aesthetic inspiration, ecosystems with which we're really intimately linked, and ecosystems, of course, that we're changing dramatically through our actions, resulting in increased frequency of wildfires, coastal erosion, threats to species diversity, drought, and famine. So climate change is arguably the greatest challenge that humans have faced ever. And we have to bring all of our intellectual powers and disciplines to bear to actually address this question and solve this problem. And how can we approach this? We need to know a lot about how the system works. How does the world work? How do ecosystems function? And where are they going? How are they changing? This is a question that science is really well equipped to answer. But it's beyond the purview of science to answer other critical questions like, what are our feelings? What are our values? And what are our aspirations as humans and as societies? This is something that's best addressed by the arts and the humanities, including things like writing and philosophy and ethics. And we really have to answer both of these questions before we can get to the big question, which is this one. What should we do? What is the right thing to do? And what is the wise course of action? This is a question that society really has to answer as a whole. And they have to answer that by being deeply informed through the sciences, the arts, the humanities, all of the disciplines to make this decision together. So what needs to happen is that we need to have a very tight connection. We need to reestablish ties between these disciplines and also facilitate communication between these disciplines and the public and policymakers. But unfortunately, this grand challenge has come at a time when these disciplines are more divided than ever. In the Renaissance, it was very common for one person, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, to be an expert in all of these fields and to be working on the cutting edge of all these fields at once. But since that time, the magnitude, the amount of information, the amount of skill required to work on the cutting edge of these fields has increased so much that it's practically no longer feasible for one person to do all of these things. But nonetheless, what we can do is strive towards a system in which society as a whole functions like the Renaissance man and can actually integrate the arts, the sciences, the humanities, and serve society and solve major problems. So how can we restore this Renaissance ideal to the functioning of our society as a whole? I'm a scientist, and it's a great joy and privilege to be able to learn more about how the world works and to do my best to actually add some new information to that. Working alongside my students and colleagues, we study the boreal forest through doing field work, working in the lab, and increasingly working on our computers, crunching terabytes worth of data to try to interpret what's happening in the forest. This is also me studying the boreal forest. So as a girl growing up in Oklahoma, I studied ballet and cello. When I went to college, I initially majored in music and then focused more on a double major in modern dance and botany as my love and fascination with the natural world grew. And as I learned more about how biological systems work from the ecosystem to the cellular all the way down to the molecular level, I became inspired to start choreographing and performing dance pieces that were based on the inherent natural structures we see all the way down to the molecular level in hopes that the beauty and the elegance of those systems would somehow carry over into my art. And I found a group of like-minded dancers, another 3, and we formed our own independent dance company called the Deliquescent Dance Ensemble in the 90s and performed throughout Oklahoma and the region. And then one by one, the dancers in my company pursued that dream that all dancers have of moving to New York City and having a successful dance career. And one by one, they all did. And I stayed behind because my motivation and desire to learn more about science compelled me to go to graduate school. So I got a master's degree in botany, a PhD in microbiology. I postdoced for 3 more years. And during that time, my ability to engage in the arts diminished. But I did keep it alive by playing the cello in a fantastical array of rock and roll bands. Until I ran out of time, the pressures of the professional career just eliminated all the time I had to do anything but science. But luckily, I loved science. And I felt very fortunate to land the dream of the scientist, to get a faculty position at a major university and get the opportunity to do research in Alaska's boreal forests. And as soon as I moved here, coming from Oklahoma, I looked at the forest and thought, it's like a magical fairyland to me. And I really wanted to understand how this system worked. And so I started talking to my colleagues and fellow ecologists at the university and learned that fire, of course, is an integral part of our boreal forest ecosystem function. And fire comes through and sets something almost like a reset button. And following fire, depending on its severity, even if it were to kill all of the living plants in that area, the plants will quickly return from seeds that are stored in the soil or seeds that blow in. And you have a whole sequence of series of plants restoring the vegetation in the forest until you return eventually to a point that generally looks something like it did before the fire, to a mature boreal forest stand. And as I started to learn this, I realized the best way for me to really understand who these plants are and what sequence they return in and how this forest functions is to return to dance and to do it through embodiment. And so I downloaded a bunch of data from our local research site, Bonanza Creek LTER. This shows the percent cover of different plant species after a really severe fire that happened in 1983. And I sent this information to my dance colleagues that were spread across the country from Oklahoma to New York City. And we choreographed movement inspired by these different species and then condensed the 25 years of data down into 12 minutes. And what resulted was this piece called Casting Shadows, which begins with the mature spruce forest, subjected to a really severe fire. And then very quickly afterwards, return of small understory plants. This is equisedum or horsetails with their very characteristic morphology. And proceeding through fireweed and alder plants that have microorganisms in their roots that can actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and give it to the plants and to the soil and enrich the ecosystem. Through the berries on which humans and wildlife in the boreal forest rely for subsistence, and through birch with its slashed bark, and eventually the canopy beginning to close again and return, moving towards that state of the forest before the fire. But what I found through working with the data is that it actually didn't return to its original state. Certainly succession was still in progress at this site, but what I know from talking to other ecologists is that increasingly as wildfires become more frequent and more severe, the forest is not following that trajectory that we previously knew. It's following new and unpredictable trajectories, causing the landscape to change at very large scales and also causing everything to change that depends on those landscapes. So through doing this, I learned a great deal as a scientist, and I know that my dance colleagues learned a lot about ecology. And we compiled this piece with much of our other repertory, and we're very fortunate to be invited by the New York City International Fringe Festival to perform in 2010, which we did, and then I suddenly looked around and realized that I just lived the dream of a dancer. I performed in New York City through a very circuitous route, mind you. But through this experience of engaging with science through the arts, I felt like that I learned a lot as a scientist. I know that my artistic colleagues learned a lot about ecology, and by presenting that to the public, society had access to this scientific information that they might not otherwise have known. And this is something that translates not only just to professional working scientists and artists, but to students. So I've worked with students from kindergarten up through the college level, And we'll learn about science, but also process that through dance, creative writing, and other sorts of creative means. And this proves to be a really effective way to engage students and excite them about science, but also promote broad integrative thinking. So you've heard a lot about STEM in education, which is extremely critical that we support all the STEM fields, but I'm one of many people that are advocating for an additional vowel for art. We cannot leave behind art and the humanities for the interest of exciting people about science, but also promoting broad, critical, creative thinking. And to eliminate this in the face of declining budgets is really a disservice to society in the long run. So through this experience, I became motivated to do more to try to strengthen what I saw as fairly weak connections between science and the arts and the humanities, and to find ways to communicate more effectively with society. And so with the help of colleagues and our local research site and the National Science Foundation, I formed a program here in Alaska called In a Time of Change. And this program over the years has sought to bring together artists with scientists and get them to focus on the local ecosystem and develop original art exhibits and live performances and ways to communicate with the public. And here's an example of one of our field trips up in the Alpine with the late wolf biologist Tom Meyer, with a group of outstanding artists. And one of the outcomes of this experience was this beautiful art piece that communicates a lot about how climate change is affecting our landscapes and particularly alpine mammals. If you look up the left side of this piece, this is showing a gradient as you move up the mountainside, up in elevation, and you'll have Arctic ground squirrels and tundra vegetation, and as you move higher, you have little pikas, which are small mammals related to rabbits that live in the rock fields. And this is under our current temperature and climate regime on the left panel. But if you look to the right, as the temperature is warm, the forest vegetation, tree line, is moving higher up the mountainside. And we have coming with that other wildlife, the ground squirrels are now moving up higher. And you can imagine what's happening now to the pikas. It's like being on an island as the sea level rises. They become isolated, and their habitat is at risk of actually winking out completely. And this proved to be a really elegant way to think of communicating a really complicated concept to the public, and also achieving some artistic goals. And I would have to say that it's much more communicative to the public than this, which is how experts in the field would communicate this concept of genetic isolation of alpine mammals. But it's an equally valid and, of course, essential form of communication for experts in the field to advance knowledge in that arena, but it's not exactly the best way to communicate with the public. So we've experimented with other ways of communicating through live performance with theater and comedy and drama, and also poetry and music, and presentations by scientists who are experts in their fields, and Alaska Native dance, really communicating through art this ancient relationship between humans and this local ecosystem, and also expressing how that's evolving and adapting over time as the climate changes. Our art exhibits will give you the cold, hard truth about the relationship between predators and prey and the environment and how ecosystems function. And we've been making efforts to try to assess the impacts of these by doing surveys of members of the audience. And what we've found is by surveying the audience that there's a statistically significant increase in the knowledge that they report after having seen the art exhibit about how ecosystems work, and also an increase in curiosity, which I think is a really great achievement to try to stimulate people to want to learn more about their local ecosystem. Also changed attitudes about humans' relationship to their ecosystem and the effects that they may be having through things like predator control. And this is not isolated just to us in Alaska, but there is a groundswell now of scientific research sites focused on local ecosystems that foster arts and humanities programs. And this is just a few examples of them, from writers' programs in Oregon all the way to programs that do real-time sonification, which is converting data into music. And many of these really combine science and the fine arts, frequently with the goal of communicating to the public. But what I want to also highlight is a really important example of where the sciences and the humanities can team up and do important collaborative research to answer these questions of what should we do. I think a beautiful example of this was done on Isle Royale National Park in Michigan by an interesting team of philosophers and scientists who investigated the wolf population that's been isolated on this island for many years and is subject to decline due to lack of genetic diversity and also disease. And it's an important question of should. What should we do? Should we reintroduce wolves? Should we perform genetic rescue? But to do that would violate our values of non-intervention in national parks and in natural systems. If these wolves are going to go extinct, should we let them do that? If that's the natural course of action? Should we let this science experiment that's happening there naturally go on, or should we stop it in the interest of a healthy ecosystem? What should we do? And this is a question that moves far beyond just science to also these questions of philosophy and ethics. So I think that in the respect to the question of what should we do, we have to continue trying to strengthen these ties between the sciences, the arts, and the humanities, and society to address these grand challenges of today. We have to strengthen all these connections. And how do we do this? We can do this by communicating across the disciplines, which includes listening, not just talking, but listening to what other workers have to say, researchers in these fields, and pursue true collaboration across the disciplines. Support broad education, convert STEM to STEAM in the schools. And overall, what we want to do is actually to harness the full power of the human imagination and use the left brain, the right brain, the whole brain of society at large to tackle these major, major grand challenges of our time. And only in doing so can we reintegrate all of the disciplines and truly see the elephant. And I would add, in addition to seeing the elephant, it would be valuable to take a moment and step aside and listen to what the elephant may have to teach us. Thank you.